I see that the panelists have all been supplied with technical equipment. I see that all of you have also, so let us begin. Let me welcome you all very warmly to this beautiful site, to this beautiful venue, the old City Hall of Wrocław, where we will begin a conference which will last all the way until Saturday night, a conference under the title The Times of Utopia, in search of the lost future, and I would like very much to welcome you all to attend all of the sessions. Tomorrow we're going to meet at a different venue, but we decided to begin today here in a very symbolic place, a debate of Central Europe, a space of utopia, or the realm of Ubu the King. In a minute I will try to explain where I got the title from, but before I do that, perhaps a few background information about the context, and then I would like to introduce our guests. Well, this conference is taking place as part of, well, the debate and the conference is taking place as part of a sort of a larger program, the City of the Future Laboratory of Wrocław, which is part, as you can suspect, of the program of the European Capital of Culture, Wrocław 2016, and as a curator of this program, my name is Edwin Bendik, and I'm a journalist with the Polityka Weekly. I would very much like to thank the City of Wrocław to have included this particular conference in the program of the European Capital of Culture. Why are we talking about utopias at all? And why is it that we will begin this conversation with this very region? Well, I remember when we were just beginning working on the program of the Capital of Culture a few years ago. It seemed some years ago that 2016, that was our hope, that 2016 would be the time after the crisis, a time of a carnival, a festivity, when we would be able to analyze the new world with the new division of powers, having survived successfully the crisis and its consequences. But the situation now is such that the Pope coming to our country tells us that the world is at war, and that is more of a context for our deliberations. And the places such as the International Monetary Fund, that for some years were able to forecast some kind of a formulae for the development of the future, are now admitting that this neoliberal model has already come to an exhaustion, that the stratification of the society leading to different tensions lead more to difficulties than benefits. And I think that fewer and fewer people have any doubts that this particular model of managing the social, economic, and political model has come to an exhaustion. Question is now, will there be a new beginning after we come to an end? And this is a question that would be the introduction to the issue of alternatives. Do we have at hand any visions of a different organization of the reality rather than returning to old solutions? Because what we're trying to do for now, and I think that it's quite visible seeing the proposals offered by rightist populists at least, these proposals are about going back to the world from 100 years ago or even older, because this is something that we had already tested. But now we don't really have any proposals that would offer any new positive solutions. And this is a question that we will be grappling with in the coming days, trying to look at this from different perspectives. Today, however, we're meeting so that to try and face and try to discuss the ideas or the ideals formulated in the cultural space and the political space, namely, on the one hand, the idea of Central Europe, which in Europe is oscillating between the Central Europe notion and the intermarum, because we have always been suspended in between the two vectors, one formulated by Milan Kundera back in the 80s, who talked about Central Europe as some kind of a purgatory for Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary that we found ourselves in as a result of the betrayal of the West. But at the same time, we were part of the West that is just simply waiting for us for this betrayal to end, and then we'll go back to the family of Western countries. And the other poll that was formulated by Paryska Kultura and Jerzy Giedroyć, the question of the reconstruction of the Jagiellonian space, of the intermarum that would be based on the alliance of Poland, Lithuania and Belarus being the source of a certain cultural identity and a political identity. After 1989, it seemed that this vision of Kundera won, that that the syndrome of the betrayal has come to an end, that we're simply all going towards the West. And this was sealed with the year 2004, when we all entered the European Union, the countries that are mostly represented here apart from Ukraine. So we have Lithuania, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, all of us joining the EU. But today now we again see that this process that supposedly had definitely come to an end is now being undermined, or at least discussed, and an attempt to try to answer where is Poland located, where is Ukraine located, where it is location of Lithuania, Czech Republic or Ukraine within this mental area, where is the south, east, west, north. This is all coming back now, and it is discussed not just by writers in their books but also by politicians. When the presidential minister, for example, is actually admitting that we are closer to the east than to the west. And if that happens, then it seems that this is an issue that is rather of importance. And so, here we have our guest today, whom we'd like to invite to a discussion and talk about this issue. And of course, inviting you to the discussion too. We have Radka Denemarkova from the Czech Republic, a writer and an author of dramas, scenarios, essayist, and a translator, and an active participant of the Czech debate, public debate. She is the only Czech writer that has received the Magnesia Litera Prize 3 times and in different categories for prose. So this is a very important prize indeed. So hello to you, Radka. And right next to her we have Katarzyna Uczkiewicz, representing Warsaw, and representing not just Warsaw, but in this debate she's also representing the Polish perspective, who is related to the Polish-Czech-Slovakian Cooperation Center at Wrocław University. She is the editor-in-chief, Pamięć and Przyszłość, Memory and the Future. She's a Bohemian scholar by education and specializes in this very region. Also, taking advantage of the fact that she knows Czech, she will help us say or solve the problem that we always have here in this region. She will be, namely, interpreting what Radka is saying in Czech into Polish, and then it's all going to be simultaneously again interpreted into English by our simultaneous interpreters. Now, moving on, let us move on to the east of it. Mykola Riabchuk, a man known to many of you, either from meetings or books that have been translated to Polish, a renowned, an outstanding journalist, a writer, political commentator with a very fearful pen, who fights the auto-stereotypes that the Ukrainians have about themselves, but in particular the stereotypes about Ukraine that are ever present in the West. So we've, for example, talked about some texts that the Dutch observers have written, a very insightful reading that was. So, hello, Mykola. And finally, Leonidas Donskis, representing Lithuania, philosopher, historian of ideas and writer, and former member of the European Parliament. Also a great scholar, author of 2 books that have been fortunately translated into Polish. Of course, he's written many more, and I hope that more of them will actually be published in Polish and available to the Polish reader. I have had the good fortune of actually being an observant of the career of Leonidas Donskis, and I have to say that his many observations pertaining to this particular region, the question of identity, memory, and to what extent these are the substance of discovery, the future, this has actually been a fascinating observation indeed. So hello, Leonidas Donskis, to you. Right, so we all know the people that will be discussing all of this with the subsequent items on the agenda I will present tomorrow, so as not to prolong this introduction. Let me just perhaps just explain the title, and then I would like to give the floor over to the panelists. Central Europe, a space of utopia, or the realm of Ubu the King? Yes, the space of utopia is a question about to what effect this area stretching somewhere from Estonia to the Balkans, from the north to the south, and from the east to the west, from Ukraine on to Poland, could actually be a source of an alternative projects of organizing social political life. To what extent, and this perhaps will be also a question to Mykola, to what extent such revolutions as the one in Ukraine were actually only local in nature, or perhaps to what extent were they a universal phenomena, serving as a harbinger, if you will, or announcing the coming or the advent of a new society, or perhaps something that we often read in French journalism, that we ever more often read about the metaphor of Ubu the King, remembering that this particular space was located in Poland, and Ubu the King was actually the Polish king. And now this metaphor is coming back particularly after 2015, in reference not only to Poland, but to this whole sort of region, as an expression of a miscomprehension of what has actually happened here over the past year and a half, when all of a sudden we've started to have doubts whether we actually are in the West or part of the West. So that would be sort of my first question to the panelists. If you could please perhaps give us a definition, a founding definition of this geography. Leonidas, where is Lithuania? To the east, west, south, north, or perhaps someplace else altogether?
Oh, thank you, Edwin. So I have to say that this question is not very simple. I remember it was in 1996 that after one interview with the then Estonian foreign minister, Toomas Hendrik Ilves, who is president of Estonia now, there was a sort of shock in Lithuania, because Toomas Hendrik Ilves made himself quite clear, saying that Estonia has very little, if any, to do with Baltic states, because Estonia is a Nordic country, so Lithuania and Latvia could pass for Baltic states. It's up to them to define themselves. But Estonia is a Nordic country. And I remember the fuss it created in Lithuania. But then, of course, people started writing and thinking that, well, after achieving independence, the Baltic states had to face one simple fact. It was one thing to describe themselves as three sisters into that same cell of that same prison, which was for a long time. But then the fact was obvious that Lithuania and her background was quite different from Latvia's and Estonia's. Lithuania is, in fact, not only a Catholic country with its Lutheran sisters in the vicinity. Lithuania is a Central European country due to Vilnius, which was and continues to be very Polish, which was very Ukrainian, Belarusian, Jewish, Russian, a typical Central European city. At the same time, Lithuania could have become something very different if not Klaipėda or Memel, my hometown, which was to become a Lithuanian town. We know the history of how it happened. So Lithuania became a Baltic state due to Klaipėda and a Central European country due to Vilnius. So the Baltic states were defined or redefined due to some cultural and historical trajectories in the region. So Latvia could be dealt with as a Baltic state with German, Swedish, other Nordic influences, and Riga, a major city in the region. And Estonia could pass for a Nordic country due to Finnish and Estonian languages and their affinities, meaning that things are very far from obvious. very far from obvious. And I believe that the Baltic region will have to redefine itself many, many, many times. Well, curiously enough, when Edwin posed this question about Ubu the King, according to Alfred Jarry, in Poland, meaning nowhere. So what came to my mind was this tradition of contempt for Eastern Europe, which is very deeply embedded in Western Europe. It's a public secret that, well, if we read Larry Wolff's Inventing Eastern Europe, it's quite obvious that this tradition to have Western philosophers who treat Eastern Europe as the playground for their ideas, it dates back to Voltaire, Diderot, it dates back to Rousseau, who never ever visited Lithuania and Poland, but who had an ambition to draft a constitution for Poland. So, and the same goes for Voltaire with his ambition. Well, he knew Prussia with Frederick the Great. He didn't know anything about Poland and Lithuania, but still he was writing about those countries. So this tradition to believe that the West emanates civilization, vis-a-vis the vast land of barbarity with Russia first and foremost, and then some other lands. So it dates back to the Enlightenment, Europe, so nothing new under the sky, so to say. We have this trajectory. And then there is an antidote. When Central European intellectuals, they revolt against this contempt. And it's very interesting, I think a unique example with Oskar Milosz, a distant cousin of Czesław Milosz, who, as we know, was a French poet of Polish background, who fell in love with Lithuania and held a series of lectures at Collège de France about Lithuania as Athens of the North. So we have a messianic impulse which comes as an antidote against this contempt for the East and for the center of Europe. So, and then we have messianic self-descriptions and self-discoveries, like this never-ending debate as to whether the center of Europe is in the Czech Republic or Ukraine or Lithuania. But this is something that goes against this well-established contempt. So, Edwin, I would say there are two kinds of responses. There is the Russian response with the self-contempt, like Chadaev, when then you choose to believe that you are good for nothing. The Enlightenment bypassed your country, the same with the Renaissance. Of course, things were different with Ukraine, but in Russia we have this trajectory. If you are not fiercely chauvinistic, imperialistically minded, so then you, in a way, internalize this Western contempt for yourself. And that's the way Pyotr Chadaev describes Russia in philosophical letters. Or Vladimir Pecherin, how sweet it is to hate one's land and eagerly await its annihilation. So, and there is another trajectory. When you revolt against this, the way Kundera does, who talks about the treason of the West, or there is a messianic propensity. It's not awfully strong in Lithuania. I would say that the most, I think, plausible and interesting messianic poets and thinkers were Poles, so not Lithuanians in Lithuania. But curiously enough, I believe that we have historical trajectories, and what is very interesting, although we find ourselves in the 21st century, we are still coping with dilemmas left from the 18th century. Nothing has changed in these terms. So you remember Czesław Milosz in his Milosz's ABC, he writes about a very derogatory term, that is annus mundi. That is annus mundi, and that is a description of one German who left it about Poland during the Second World War. But again, this derogatory term or this attitude to Central Europe as the land where there is only barbarity and no principle of civilization can be discovered. This has to do with the mental geography of the West, or I would say the mental or the political imagination of the West, if you will. So I remember there was a time when in Lithuania there was a joke, meaning that how much time do you have to spend in the United States trying to explain the difference between Russia and Lithuania, for instance. But I would say that, okay, but there is a long way to go. America is a very distant country. But the same used to happen in Sweden or Finland. Not in Finland, in Sweden, I would say, which is a neighboring country. Meaning that each time you would have to toil very, very hard trying to get rid of this stigma of an Eastern European. The stigma created by the West. And that's why I think it's very important to remember that there is a special category of Eastern and Central Europeans, people who try to return the sense of dignity to Eastern Europe. I would say that Poland played a very important role in this way because Czesław Miłosz was one of those people. The same could be said about Jerzy Giedroyć. The same could be said about John Paul II. Eastern or Central Europeans who returned the sense of dignity to this region, described as the secondary or second-rank Europe, so to say. And I would end by saying, I would finish my remark by remembering Czesław Miłosz. That was a very graceful description of the difference between West and East Europeans. Miłosz wrote that for an Italian from Tuscany, there is no reason to prove that he is from Europe. He starts celebrating life with a wine, with a glass of wine, with everything. He is just Italian and he's from Tuscany, and that's all. And the difference is that a Lithuanian or Polish, especially Lithuanian intellectual, should spend 2-3 hours trying to cover the territory of what it means to be a European, of course, in the audience of West Europeans. So this is a very difficult lot, and I don't think that we got rid of it. And I believe that on the one side, it's a stigma. On the other side, that's an identity market. Central Europe has always been very rich of identity markets. You remember when the Grand Duchy of Lithuania started crumbling, and what we had was a very tragic consequence of the divorce between Poland and Lithuania in terms of culture and everything. We had a very interesting situation before Lithuania proclaimed its independence, when one family member could regard him or herself as Belarusian, another as Lithuanian, the third as Polish. So I think it's still a possibility.
Dziękuję bardzo. Będziemy jeszcze wracać już w kontekście
Thank you very much.
Teraz
We are
przejdziemy
definitely
na,
going to go
osi,
back
na
to the
drugi
political
koniec
context,
stołu i
but
też
now we are
tego
going to
regionu, czyli
move
do
to
Czech.
the
I
other
poprosimy o
side of the
zmierzenie się
table,
z
the other side of the
pytaniem
axis.
Radki
We're going to move to the
Denemarkowej. Jak
Czech
to pytanie
Republic,
o
and I'm going to
gdzie
ask
są
Radka
Czechy
Denemarkova
z punktu widzenia, czy w
the
ogóle
same question.
ono wywołuje jakiekolwiek zastanowienie,
Where
czy Czesi po prostu
is
już dawno
Czechia?
rozwiązali ten problem,
Or have
wiedzą,
actually the
gdzie
Czechs
są
already
i
managed to
nie
resolve the
zastanawiają się.
issue and are no longer wondering what next?
Będę mówić po czesku, bo już jestem zmęczona tym, że na wszystkich konferencjach mówi się po angielsku.
I'm going to be speaking Czech because I am tired of the omnipresent English language at all conferences. At the same time, we are all told that we have to preserve our little European languages.
Gdziekolwiek bym nie pojechała
Wherever I go, wherever I travel around the world, nobody really knows where the Czech Republic is. I always tell people that it is in Europe.
Albo powiem Praga i wtedy
So what I say is Prague simply.
Franz Kafka.
And people associate it immediately with Franz Kafka and Milan Kundera.
Franz Kafka pisał po niemiecku, a
Franz Kafka wrote in German,
pisać po francusku.
whereas Milan Kundera actually began his literary career with writing in French.
Kiedy jako pisarki pytają mnie, gdzie jest moja ojczyzna, to mówię, że jest to
When
cały
I'm
świat.
asked where my motherland is, where my homeland is, when I'm asked that question as a writer, I usually tell people that my entire world is my homeland. I am very sorry, I cannot hear the speaker.
Jeżeli chodzi o literaturę, to nikt z tym nie ma problemu.
Now, in
natomiast
terms
w
of
każdej
literature,
innej
nobody
wszyscy
has a
mają
problem,
problem z tym.
whereas when it comes to any other area, people do have an issue.
Jeżeli chodzi o Republikę Czeską i w ogóle
In
Europę
terms of the Czech
Wschodnią,
Republic
to
and
zawsze
in
są z tym
terms of
problemy, ponieważ
Eastern
Europa
Europe in
Wschodnia
general,
zawsze ma
we always have a problem
jakieś
there.
takie
Why?
naznaczenie bardzo
Because
konkretne.
Eastern Europe is to a certain extent stigmatized. Europe does feature a number of countries and everybody knows them, whereas Eastern Europe does have its issues. We do feel that stigmatization mentioned by the previous speaker.
Jeżeli coś łączy Europę Środkową, to są
Should
te
anything
dziesięciolecia, stulecia
blend
krzywd,
Europe
dramatycznych historii, które
to
razem
Central
niesiemy.
Europe, I do believe that we are bound with the centuries of hurt, centuries of conflict, centuries of war.
2016 a nikdy bych nevěřila, že se budou zase u nás třeba v Čechách vytahovat ty staré křivdy, že se objeví, co pak populismus a mediální kampaň, s tím jsem počítala, ale s tím, že se znovu objeví antisemitismus, rasismus, že se staré křivdy, to znamená, že sice France Kafku potřebujeme jako lákadlo na turisty a přes France Kafku my jsme součástí světové kultury, ale nechce přiznat, že Franz Kafka byl židovské rodiny, kdyby žil déle, pravděpodobně by zemřel v koncentračním táboře a pokud by přežil, tak bychom ho odsunuli.
Więc w związku z tym się co jakiś czas powtarzają,
This is why
nie chce się w
I
to
believe,
wierzyć, dawne, stare jakieś krzywdy,
albeit
wytyczenia,
it is
między innymi
difficult to believe,
prawda, cały czas się zachwycamy
hurts
Franzem
keep
Kafką i
on
mówimy, że go
recurring.
potrzebujemy, ale nie chcemy już
We
przyznać się
are
do tego,
marveling at
że gdyby żył
Franz
dłużej,
Kafka,
prawdopodobnie skończyłby w obozie
but we do not want to admit that were he to live longer, he would end up in a concentration camp.
Společnou střechou. Já si myslím, že se ukazuje, že naopak jsou to samostatné domky, kde se musíme naučit soužití a jakousi identitu, protože skutečně ta každá země má svoji mentalitu, svoje historii, svoji kulturu, protože když jedu i Austrálií, tak je tisíce kilometrů, nic se nemění. V Evropě, která je malá, tak jedete několik stovek kilometrů, někde několik desítek kilometrů, je jiný jazyk, mentalita, obsah talíře a jsou to drobné věci, které se skládají po staletí, takže tam je potřeba si uvědomit, že ta hranice vede skutečně od člověka k člověku a jsou to potom drobné kroky, například dnes, že jste mi dovolili mluvit česky.
Kiedy po 1989 roku wchodziliśmy
When
do Europy,
after
to mówiliśmy, że Europa to
1989
jest
we were
jeden
joining
dom,
Europe, we
pod
all
wspólnym
claimed
dachem.
that
Tymczasem
Europe
okazuje
is
się, że to
our
jest
own common
osiedle
home,
domów,
our common roof,
każdy dom ma
whereas
swój
it
dach, każdy
turns
ma swoje
out that
zwyczaje,
it is but a
zupełnie
settlement,
inny
it
jest
is a
niekiedy
conglomerate of
co
settlements,
kilkadziesiąt kilometrów,
different roofs,
zawartość,
different
nie tylko
people,
język i mentalność, ale nawet
and
zawartość talerza. W porównaniu na przykład z
customs
Australią,
change,
gdzie setki
food
kilometrów
changes
jest bardzo
even
podobnie. Natomiast ta
every
Europa to jest
100
raczej, to są
kilometers as
odrębne
opposed to
domki,
Australia,
w
for
którym
example,
każdy
where
ma swoje zwyczaje i
customs
każdy
and food
potrzebuje
tends to
swojej
be
odrębności, swojej
identical,
intymności.
tend to be identical, whereas in Europe we do need our intimacy.
Tak samozřejmě v té české společnosti se neustále připomíná ta slavná polemika z roku 68-69 mezi Milanem Kunderou a Václavem Havlem. Ještě můžu.
Więc warto tutaj przypomnieć słynną polemikę
So
z
I would like to
roku
remind you of the
intelektualną
famous polemics 1969 polemics between Kundera and Václav Havel.
Jenom drobně připomenout, když to zjednoduším, šlo o to, že Milan Kundera nevěřil žádným občanským aktům angažovaným, kdežto Václav Havel, což se u něho ukázalo, že to byla správná taktika, že to je donkichotská pomalá práce, jestli chce člověk změnit společnost, nemůže čekat na nějaký projekt, že víme, že revoluce ani reformy ze shora nic nezmění, že to je otázka, on tomu říkal, já to nemám ta slova ráda, ale použiju je, on tomu říkal existenciální revoluce, pak používal slovo duchovní obroda a sebeuvědomění člověka, že to je jediná cesta, samozřejmě je nejtěžší. Ale myslím, a dneska se ukazuje, že ani otázka demokracie, otázka lidských práv nemůžete nikde naroubovat, protože ta totalita trvá jiným způsobem. A třeba co se týká Čechy, které se velice orientují teď na Čínu a na Rusko, tak ten ekonomický pragmatismus zablokoval i ty hodnoty, které já na Evropě mám ráda.
To była, żeby przypomnieć krótko, taka
Let me remind you briefly of the Kundera-Havel polemics. Kundera didn't really believe in grassroots work that could serve to change the reality or the world, whereas such was the precise foundation of Havel's philosophy. Life according to certain values, self-awareness,
szoterskiej, która wydawało się przez długie lata, że odniosła pewien sukces, natomiast w dzisiejszych
work that would definitely resemble
kiedy w Czechach jest bardzo
Don
społeczeństwo zwrócone ku Rosji, ku
Quixote,
Chin, ku
whereas in Russia,
widzimy, że
which tends to
rzeczywiście
lean
te
towards
takie
China,
twarde,
we
ekonomiczne,
do see that
kwestie,
the rather
jakby po raz kolejny
hard
spychają wartości
economic
napędarzy.
matters do tend to put values on the back burner.
Že existuje něco jako národní úděl. My máme v Čechách, že národním údělem být mezníkem mezi východem, západem a že nějakým způsobem to musíme vydržet, protože jestliže něco naroubujete, že to je národní úděl, tak na to se tím se vysvětlí, že proto jsme třeba v tom roce 68 podepsali naše politická reprezentace moskevské protokoly, proto teď musíme zase být sticha, protože když to Rusko a Čína jsou tak silné, tak my musíme. To jsou nebezpečné konstrukty, které se u nás třeba v Čechách opakují, přitom ještě v 19. století, protože to 19. století je teď pro mě velké téma, kde to začíná, všechny ty národní témata a národní zjednodušení, tak ještě třeba v Čechách to byla otázka rozhodnutí, jest to češství nebo němectví, což je vlastně obrovské téma pro mě dodnes.
Taka kwestia, która się zawsze pojawia już od XIX wieku, to jest
So we
kwestia
do have a certain matter that has cropped up back in the 19th century, the national fate, the national history attributed to a specific nation. I really do not like that particular concept, but the concept is very strong in the Czech Republic. People do assume that a nation has a certain task to fulfill, a certain modus operandi, and this is exactly what people are saying about 1968, with the ultimate protocols all being signed in Moscow, albeit the beginnings go back to the 19th century, the beginnings of such way of thinking. This is why we, at the end of the day, we have to determine whether we are the German element or the Czech element.
Viděna ta Evropa, nebo ta střední Evropa, naše oblast, je také důležité, v jakém kontextu to člověk vidí a tak dále. A to bych ubírala moc času. Nedávno jsem byla na konferenci, kde jeden z účastníků si vzal slovo a mluvil 3/4 hodiny a bylo mu úplně jedno, že mu říkali stop, takže končím.
Takže to, oczywiście ma to bardzo cały szereg różnych kontekstów.
That obviously does carry a number of philosophical or historical contexts, but I believe that is all in a nutshell to begin with. We will go back to the topic. Thank you very much. Now we are going to move towards us. We are going to leave Ukraine for dessert, not because we value her less. But, well, Wrocław definitely is a great place to be in terms of answering certain questions, because the symbolism of history and the symbolism of the city and of the nation actually are all mutually permeated. And I must say that thanks to Wrocław, we have also moved to a certain extent to the west. We actually discussed the future and the memory of Wrocław and Lviv with Taras Wozniak. And I do believe that we should definitely reconsider the matter. Poland is also quite an interesting country in terms of border morphing and changing. So I do believe that we should try and ask to what extent does political geography influence our mentality. I do believe that is a great topic to discuss also in Wrocław as a European capital of culture. I'm sorry, but the speaker's microphone seems to be slightly off. I have had a very interesting discussion recently about the culture and history of Poland. Poles believe that Polish history is the history of Central Europe, whereas Polish history is actually the history of Eastern Europe, regardless of whether we agree or not.
This question, this
jest to, że
thesis
rzeczywiście
touches
możemy
upon a
powiedzieć, że w
number
Polsce,
of
czyli nigdzie,
foundations. Well, in Poland,
gwałtowna zmiana terytorialna, która
that is to say,
nastąpiła po
nowhere.
II wojnie światowej,
The
sprawiła, że jeżeli zapytamy,
change that
gdzie
occurred
w tej
after
Polsce, to co
World
mamy na
War
myśli,
II
jeżeli mówimy w Polsce?
has led to a
Mamy na
series of
myśli Kamieniec
questions.
Podolski, czy mamy na myśli
Are we
Legnicę?
after
Trudno jest,
Legnicą,
że tak
Legnicą,
naprawdę to
Legnica,
na pierwszy
or
rzut oka
are we
to
after
jest oczywiście prosto, bo jest
Königsberg
mapa.
or Kamieniec
Natomiast
Pomorski?
po
So
głębszym zastanowieniu
we should
nie jest to
definitely, we
oczywista
can obviously
odpowiedź.
look at the map.
Więc w tym
Nonetheless,
sensie
once
faktycznie
we take a closer look
Polska
at this map,
jest,
the answer is not that obvious.
można powiedzieć, że przez długie stulecia była niewątpliwie
Poland
w
has for many
geograficznie,
centuries
choćby wschodniej.
been part
W
of
tej chwili,
Eastern Europe. That
natomiast
goes without
Polska
saying.
nigdy,
Whereas
w takim myśleniu o naszym
in terms,
Polski,
or when
raczej
it
ją
comes to
chcielibyśmy usadawiać w
the
Europie
way we
Środkowej,
think
o ile nawet nie w
about
Europie Zachodniej.
Poland, we
Bo
would
przecież
like to see
wspomniany
Poland
tu
as
Miłosz,
part
Stara
of
Europa
Central, if not
i
Western Europe.
cały szereg polskich
The
intelektualistów
aforementioned
odwoływał się do tego,
Czesław
że
Miłosz
Polska
and
była
other
częścią
intellectuals have
kultury
always in their work been
europejskiej,
referring to the
rozumianej
fact
jako
that
zachodnioeuropejska.
Poland had been
Frankofonia
part
powszechna w
of
Polsce przecież,
European culture, West
także na to
European
wskazywała.
culture.
Ja pamiętam,
And
czytałam
I do
kiedyś
believe
reportaże,
that Poland
Gabriela
as a
García
francophone
Márqueza z Polski z lat
country
50.,
also proves that. I
gdzie on
remember
opisywał
Gabriel
niezwykły
García
kraj, gdzie w
Márquez,
pociągach większość ludzi
who
jest
wrote in the
ubrana jak żebracy
1950s
i większość ludzi mówi po
that
francusku.
the majority of
Mamy
people
znowu
on
to
the
samo w
train
Polsce,
are
czyli
dressed
gdzie to jest,
like
na wschodzie, na
beggars, and
zachodzie,
yet they all speak French.
centrum.
So, and that was about
Natomiast
Poland. So
myślę,
where are
że,
we?
z
Are
drugiej
we
strony,
centrally or
nawiązując do naszych czeskich
easterly or
sąsiadów,
westwardly
chyba w
located?
przedostatniej albo
But
ostatniej powieści
were I
Joachima
to
Topola
comment
także pada
on
pytanie,
our
co to
Czech
jest Europa Środkowa?
guest,
I
well,
okazuje
Joachim
się,
Topol
a zwłaszcza
asked
co to jest
a
Europa
question in
Wschodnia.
one of
Okazuje się,
his
że
most recent
Europa
novels.
Środkowa jest generalnie
What
na zachód
is
od Europy
Central
Wschodniej. To znaczy
Europe? And
my-
the ultimate answer seems to be that Central
Wschodnia,
Europe seems to be to the
okazuje
west
się,
of
że,
Eastern Europe.
Ta Europa Wschodnia to jest
And
jeszcze
it
ten
turns
kawałek
out
na
that
wschód.
Eastern Europe
Tu,
is
gdzie
the
u nas
last
to jest
bit to the
środkowa.
east. So where we
A
are
więc Europa
now
Środkowa to
is
jest takie
definitely
miejsce,
Central Europe.
taki
In
przedsionek
other
tej Europy
words,
Zachodniej. My
Central
wiemy, że nie
Europe,
jesteśmy
we are
jeszcze tą
on the,
Europą
let's
Zachodnią,
say,
ale
on the
wschodnią to na
threshold
pewno,
or
jak
of
tutaj
Western
już padało,
Europe.
prawda? Wschód
We are
to jest już
maybe not
barbaria, to
the
jest dzik.
west.
My jesteśmy
We are maybe we're not part
takim
of Western
przedsionku
Europe.
Europy, trochę może
Nonetheless, we are
gorszej,
definitely not
ale,
East Europeans.
ale
Eastern
jednak
Europe has
nie
always
wschodniej.
been
Tymczasem
associated with something slightly
geograficznie
barbaric. So this is
przesunięcie
where we are
granic
mentally.
spowodowało, że
Now, with
faktycznie
regard to
Polska w tej chwili
geography,
jest, można powiedzieć,
once
geograficznie
borders
w sercu
have
Europy.
shifted, yes, Poland
I
today
jeżeli
is in the
rzeczywiście
very heart of
pomyślimy o
Europe,
tym,
in the
że
center of Europe.
Europejczycy
Were
środkowi,
we to
czy
consider the
centralna Europa
fact
to jest Europa, która
that
aspiruje,
Central
która
Europe
się nie koncentruje na sobie i nie uważa,
is
że
a Europe
tylko
that aspires,
odnosi się
it
cały czas do Zachodu, to zapewne w tej
looks to the
centralnej Europie
West. It does
jesteśmy.
not only focus on
Natomiast,
itself. Were we
ja
to
myślę,
consider
że
that a
Europa Środkowa
definition,
to
we
jest
can
w ogóle
definitely conclude
cały
that
czas
we are part
to jest właśnie ta
of
przestrzeń utopii cały czas.
Central
I jest to
Europe.
przestrzeń, która nigdy realnie
And
nie
the Central
zaistniała,
Europe is
bo
definitely a space for utopia,
nie
a
sądzę, żeby
utopian
wynikało
space.
ona z potrzeb
I
mieszkańców
don't
Europy
think
Środkowej,
that,
takie określenie, żeby wynikało.
the,
Zawsze był to jakiś konstrukt
term
intelektualny, który
itself
budowaliśmy sobie,
had not
żeby
really
opisać swoje
been the
miejsce.
derivative of
A
the
jak się
will
ma do
of
tego
Central
Wrocław?
Europeans.
No
Now, how does
w ogóle
Wrocław relate
jest
to
miastem
the
niezwykłym, bo
concept?
on
Well,
w
Wrocław
Polsce
in
był
itself is an
bardzo krótko.
extraordinary
Wiadomo, że
city.
wszystkie kamienie we
It
Wrocławiu mówią
has,
po polsku i Odra szumi po polsku i tak
not
dalej.
been with
Ale
us in
jednak,
Poland for a very long
Wrocław
time.
był
We do know that
miastem
all
i
stones in
polskim,
Wrocław
i
speak
czeskim,
Polish,
i
and the river
habsburskim, i
Oder
pruskim. I także w
sings
czasie,
in
kiedy
Polish.
przynależał do
Nonetheless, we
różnych,
do know that
do różnych państw,
Wrocław has been part of
samorząd
Prussia
Wrocławia
and the
bardzo
Habsburg
samodzielnie
Empire.
sobie poczynał
And we also know that in the past,
także ze swoimi
the
władcami, których był lennikiem.
administrators of Wrocław yet
być może o tyle
had been quite lenient in terms of what they decided to do, also in terms of approaching their superiors. So I do believe that Wrocław does not really care what others say about it. Janusz Tischler said upon arriving in Wrocław that
Warszawa się nami nie interesuje. A we Wrocławiu
he said that Wrocław is an amazing place because in all other cities people say, Warsaw doesn't care about us, whereas in Wrocław everybody says we don't care about Warsaw. So I do believe that Wrocław is quite amazing because it does not seek its identity in comparison with others. So now we're going to move to Mykola Riabchuk, to the Ukraine. Well, we would also want to ask, how does the question concerning mental geography translate into political projects? How does that relate to political projects? How does that relate to the answer where we are as the subject and object of international policy? Ladies and gentlemen, Ukraine is a very strange European country, one of the last to believe in the idea of Europe. So it did seem to us that the idea is well-nigh dead, whereas we still believe that European utopia. The country is very, very strange. Two utopias seem to be clashing there. Two countries or two utopias always clash. Progressive utopia and a retroactive utopia. That is the term that comes to mind. And that seems to be quite natural. It is the first term that comes to mind. So what we needed was the cyclic history to be translated into linear history. And this is when utopias transpire, progressive visions with appropriate reactions, such as conservative utopias, for example. Our progressive utopia in, well, let's say democratic, wearing in democratic clothing, or rather in socialist clothing, it had clashed with Soviet or Russian utopia, and that clash had gone on for ages, for decades. I do believe that over the last years, the latter had actually been dismissed as not very popular, but we are still left with the progressive utopia wearing European clothing, which is obviously quite interesting. So what we have in Ukraine is not really an amazing clash, but Gerasimov or Timothy Schneider do discuss or define the Ukrainian revolution or utopia as the first post-modernist revolution or utopia. I do believe that we are actually replicating what the Poles did in 1989. We did not manage in 1991 or 2004. Now we are on our third attempt, and please God, may it be successful. So we are definitely replicating what was going on before in Eastern or Central Europe, if you will. Ideas remain the same. The fundamental ideas of those revolutions had been those of freedom, which has a beautiful romantic sound to it. Nonetheless, there were other matters important there. That is the national or national liberation idea, to get ourselves liberated from under the Soviet thumb, not to mention the idea of prosperity. It is always about progress. Progress comprises freedom, but also prosperity, welfare state. The welfare state, prosperity for everyone. I do believe that this is something that has been and is important for us, or to us in the Ukraine. Watching Europe, I do believe that this idea has not been fully successful. the crisis of liberal democracy on the one hand, but I believe that liberal democracy, we are experiencing a shortage of liberal democracy. This is something that we have also been repeating and replicating in the Ukraine. We are replicating ideas and disappointments. Hungary are the most, I believe, disappointed nation. Hungary is what comes to mind. So the liberal democratic utopia, something that was developed in the 19th century, definitely bore fruit in the form of the prosperity of welfare state, of social democracy, which led to the Marxist conflict between labor and capital. The haves and the have-nots have been defined, but I believe that the solution was palliative in nature. In other words, the issue, the conflict, has been pushed away and out into the third world. And I do believe that this conflict is now being repeated on a global scale. This conflict has actually been swept under the carpet. Nonetheless, it has not been resolved. It has been pushed away and out by the first world into the third world. Obviously, theoretically, I could weave my own utopia, my own personal reflection on Jean Raspail's novel, The Camp of the Holy. I do believe that, well, that is, I believe, a 1973 novel. We didn't really have many refugees then, but Raspail discussed a situation or certain circumstances as a result of which refugees are coming into Europe on hugely crowded ships, hugely crowded vessels, and Europeans don't really know what to do. They do not dare shoot, but they don't really have a solution. And the author does not really offer any solutions. He just describes a very sad situation of France collapsing to a certain extent. I do believe that there could be a solution to the situation, but it would definitely require three separate changes. Primarily, the entire mankind would have to take a different, have a different take on global resources. So we would have to change our rogue economy in terms of how we treat the planet. We would have to put a stop to hyperconsumption. This is a sin that we are all guilty of in the first world. We use and consume more than we need. And now we would also need another change. So this is a change that we would need globally. Secondly, we would also need a change to the entire global economic system. This is something that Wallerstein have been and colleagues have been writing about, and this is something that this is a difficult thing to imagine as well. The inequalities transpiring over centuries are definitely a fact, and I do not really see a solution, which ultimately means that the abyss between the first and the third world shall be growing deeper. Such is the structure of the global economy, tariffs and such like. Thirdly, a problem which might seem slightly easier to resolve. Well, the first world tends to tolerate the corrupt governments of the third world because people who steal and are fraudulent, in the Ukraine among others, they simply really tend to conceal their funds in the West. Everybody's happy, the West is happy, the banks is happy, and the Russian or former Soviet oligarchs are also happy. I do believe that aid provided to third world countries, for example, in Africa, makes no sense whatsoever if that self-saved money is at the same time laundered in Western banks. I do believe that all these problems are definitely an issue. As long as these problems remain unresolved, we are going to be facing ever-growing crises. And in closing, I would like to emphasize yet again that the utopia that we had to face, the progressive European utopia, which had still been alive during the previous century, it definitely had a number of advantages. Nonetheless, I believe that it tended to underestimate certain values, but also certain structural problems, structural issues, which are definitely considerable, and they disallow any equality to the different communities of different states.
Mykola, since you're at the microphone, I have one more question, because so far we've been able to diagnose where we are on this map and how it all influences politics. This is also a question that I would like to add to ask the rest of the panelists. But let me ask in addition, to what extent this space of our societies can be a source of universal propositions? To what extent can we offer some perhaps utopian but positive solutions that could also be used by the West in solving the pan-European crisis? We have different answers, different responses. For example, the fact that we've been able to conserve certain values pertaining to religion that we perhaps could be able to export to the lay Western communities. Of course, I'm not going to give you any hints, but what do you think? Yeah, well, religious values and generally traditional values is not the monopoly of Europe. It's a Russian monopoly, I would say. They're actually trying to sell this off to the world, hypocritically, no doubt, because there is nothing behind it, no essence. I don't think that Western Europe could actually export, or Eastern Europe could export anything to the West. Not that we have anything to export, but simply because of the fact that it is not interesting, because all the new ideas, they have to be forged somewhere in New York or Berlin or Paris, and only then will they be appreciated. Even if the authors are people from the East, they still have to sell off these ideas, make these ideas, create these ideas in those places. This is how the system's built. There may be some exceptions, no doubt, but not really. So even this whole Ukrainian revolution that was basically maybe even the triumph of European ideals, it still was marginalized. I'm constantly asked by journalists whether this was a coup or a revolution. Then I ask, well, what about Paris or Berlin? Was it a revolution or was it a coup? So I constantly have to answer these silly questions. So I don't believe it. Okay, so let us go back to the Czech Republic and the same question. Is Central Europe, the Czech Republic, can the Czech Republic be a source of inspiration for the West? Maybe there is some kind of an export product, an ideological product that you would like to export.
Já na to odpovím vlastně tady, jak jste mluvil, tak mě to zase inspirovalo, že my vždycky tady, když mluvíme o té střední východně, střední Evropě nebo východní Evropě nebo vůbec o Evropě, tak vždycky hledáme, proč něco funguje, nefunguje, co se to vlastně děje. Ale když to obrátím, tak třeba ty poslední 2 roky ukázaly, že Evropa je oblast, ve které nebo podle které chce žít spousta lidí ve světě, nebo je to prostor, kde se přes všechny problémy určité kroky které se blíží té utopii jisté spravedlivé společnosti, minimálně kde je právní stát například, nebo kde se snažíme o důstojný život pro každého, že se to povedlo. Jenom ty lidé ve světě, když to zjednoduším, kteří k nám přicházejí, tak nevědí, jak ve svých zemích podobný systém vytvořit.
The last 2 years have shown, and all those migrations have shown, that many people in the world have this dream to come and live in Europe, where there are certain values still observed pertaining rule of law, or actually the state trying to provide dignity in their citizens' life. And it's very attractive, and they see that it's attractive, but they don't know how they could actually introduce such models back at home.
To, co se teda bohužel povedlo, a bylo to skutečně hlas ze zdola v tom roce 68, který prolomil tu lhostejnost, že se povedla i jedna věc, která se nevede v současné nebo v těch posledních 2 letech, kdy když je nějaká krizová situace, tak objevuje se to i v jazyce, ten to nasává. Například ve slově solidarita, že místo, aby byla ten pozitivní význam solidarity, tak se zase vracíme do té solidarity národních zemí nebo toho vidění nacionalistického, jako kdyby ty práva se dělala potom pro, já nevím, pro Angličany, Čechy, Poláky. Takže ale existovala jistá rovina, která byla v té kulturní oblasti, a to je rovina společného lidství, která vede, a to nedám, že ta hranice vede od člověka k člověku. A vlastně já musím říct, že teď píšu o Evropě jsem psala pro Dandu, to je takový čínský sborník, nebo čínský, který může vycházet jenom na Tajvanu. A z hlediska Číny samozřejmě ta Evropa je oblast, kterou si skopírovali, samozřejmě ve všech možných směrech a mocensky by ji třeba chtěli ovládnout, ale mluvím o tom proto, že tehdy jsem zase pochopila, jak jsem byla velice kritická k ideji Evropské unie, tak ta pozitiva přetrvávají. A ta je potřeba připomínat, než to, co nás rozděluje, nebo a také už mě musím říct, leze na nervy právě to dělení, protože i v té Evropě, když se sejdete i na těch konferencích mezi lidmi, kteří jsou vzdělaní, tak to jsem zažila jednou, že Francouz řekne, ale kultura, to jsme my Francie, a to ostatní jsou nedochůdčata, zvlášť ta východní Evropa, to jsou země, které jsou ještě v pubertě. Takže už máte pozici občana druhé kategorie. A to, myslím, také musí přestat v rámci Evropy.
So what we see, or what I see, is that, for example, in China, the model of the European Union remains to be attractive, and there are efforts made to introduce this model into other cultural realms, as many institutions and solutions that we already see as somewhat pathological sometimes, or imperfect, that it's still outside, on the outside scene as something that is desired, whereas we see it in a more distorted mirror, not seeing or not noticing their rather positive image that also applies to times from before 1989. For example, in 1968, when in Czechoslovakia there was a certain solidarity that was simply understood by all. Today, the word solidarity even has a more of a pejorative sense, like a solidarity of nations or a solidarity of certain groups against other groups, and that applies to different political groups, but also a cultural space. For example, a Frenchman that speaks about culture, he or she means French culture, that culture is French. And the Eastern Europe is like the smaller brother that still has much to learn.
Takže já otázku na vaši odpověď dávám v románu, který právě dokončuji a jmenuje se Hodiny z olova.
So the answer to this question can be found in a book that I'm just working on. I don't know when it will be in Polish, but the Czech title is A Clock Made of Lead, in a rough translation. Hopefully it will be published in Polish, so in that book you'll be able to find my diagnosis of the situation. But perhaps could you at least give us a hint of what this diagnosis is about?
Čína mě šokovala a zároveň mě šokuje v posledních letech Evropa. Jsou to příběhy Evropanů v Číně.
To jest o losach Europejczyków
It's about these are about, or this book is about description of different life stories of Europeans in China.
A především pro mě je zásadní, že jak ta Čína ukázala něco, co tu ještě nebylo, že se tam políbilo to nejhorší z komunismu a nejhorší z kapitalismu a ekonomicky to funguje a i ta Evropa to obdivuje, takže jsem vymetla veškerý slovník, ta slova jako socialismus, komunismus, kapitalismus, která neustále používáme, nic neznamenají. To znamená, a zároveň ty postavy, které tam mám, tak je to celý lidský život, jestli to stačí. Tak...
Więc tam są bohaterami, są ludzie na różnym
protagonists or the main characters are people at different stages of their lives. It's generally a book about a Europe that I used to love and that I see is coming to an end, and I don't know what's next. And this confrontation with China makes this whole vocabulary that I use, or this whole glossary that I use, like communism, socialism, capitalism, is coming to an end, because via the prism of China, we see how China was able to actually merge all that is worst coming from all those systems, socialism, communism, and capitalism. And economically, it does work, and it is at the same time admired in Europe. So the diagnosis is such that the Europe that I admired, that I used to be my own, has come to an end.
Mám tam motto z jedné básně Emily Dickinsonové.
So, of course, the title is Hours of Lead, and that the title's been inspired, or I drew inspiration from one of the poems by Emily Dickinson. Okay, let us move on to Lithuania, and the same question to you. Would you confirm, or do you agree with the fact that we don't really have much to propose, or are you more optimistically inclined?
I'm not pessimistic at this point, I can say, because, well, honestly, since I spent 5 years of my life, which I wouldn't describe as unhappy years of my life in the European Parliament in Brussels, I would say that I've seen so much naivete of Western Europe that, there is something that has to be learned from Central and Eastern Europe, and that's for sure. First and foremost, the question of Edwin is very, very relevant, since we are talking about some sort of export and import of utopian mindset. The utopia, which has been at least fueled and supported in Eastern Europe, but which is quite widespread in the West, is the utopianism of human rights. I'm a human rights defender myself, please don't get me wrong, and I'm absolutely deadly serious about human rights, but the problem is that what was striking was that I've seen many curious things concerning mental geography, which was mentioned by Edwin several times. Let me explain this. When it comes to human rights ideology in the 20th century, there is a very firm monopoly, very firm moral monopoly in North America and Western Europe. They firmly believe that they can lecture East and Central Europeans on human rights. When it comes to the gallery of saints, it is only Russians, Ukrainians, Czechs, Václav Havel, Solidarity people of Poland, that is Andrei Sakharov, Vladimir Bukovsky, that is, the gallery of saints, Elena Bonner, Petro Grigorenko, Semyon Gluzman, and the rest of the company. When it comes to the Andrei Sakharov award in the European Parliament, which is a supreme award for human rights and democracy, there was not a single person in Western Europe to be selected as the symbol. That was only from Eastern Europe, which clearly sends the signal that although NGOs, and policymakers, they reserve the right to lecture East and Central Europeans about human rights. When it comes to the real things on the ground, they cannot manage without Eastern and Central European examples and practitioners. And this brings me to the thought that what happened was that they started confusing very obvious things. In Eastern and Central Europe, human rights were not a utopia. That was part of dissent. That was the dissent, which was absolutely instrumental and indispensable after the Helsinki Accords. This allowed to delegitimize the Soviet Union. And the Helsinki groups in Kiev, Moscow, Vilnius, and Tallinn were instrumental in dismantling the empire symbolically and politically. In the West, I'm afraid to say this was just a kind of control of political vocabulary, the struggle for political vocabulary. That was quite naive, so to say. And that's why when I see the reports, I was the rapporteur on the 2011 report on democracy and human rights in the world, myself. And when I can witness what's happening when people prepare the reports, and they regard the loss of human life among journalists in Russia, killing and political assassinations in Russia and China have the same kind of problem as Edward Snowden in the United States, or some other things, I think that's the sancta simplicitas issue. That's the holy naivete, meaning that they appropriated, they hijacked the entire narrative of Central and Eastern Europe without noticing it. But at the same time, they reserved the right to lecture. These people mixing it up and simply losing any kind of raison d'etre, stripping themselves of this raison d'etre. Why I'm mentioning this sense of being, sense of existence? Because for obvious things, people needed inspiration. Before the Second World War, that was the Spanish Civil War, which was the raison d'etre for Trotskyites and Stalinists, or for West Europeans. Things that they're over, so that's why they needed the new inspiration, and that was human rights. That's something that came from Eastern and Central Europe, filling the gap, so to say. But I am not very optimistic about the success of human rights discourse because of many obvious problems. Can we believe that it's possible to pursue these politics to such a degree that, you know, the Dutch or Swedish standards in gender equality would apply to Iran or the Arab countries? You have to be incurably naive to believe that this would happen in the coming 5 decades or so. But what is part of East Central European legacy, or active, so to say, which could be used in the West, I think, and I mean it, that would be Jerzy Giedroyc's or Czesław Miłosz's legacy in terms of self-definition. For instance, in Lithuania, I believe, it was very helpful trying to overcome our moral provincialism, especially Lithuanian nationalism. I remember after the collapse of the Soviet Union, nationalism was approached as the sole instrument of self-definition and, you know, the return of the sense of pride. All of a sudden, Lithuania, which was driven by the idea that let's discover what is Lithuanian in Lithuanian history, all of a sudden it was replaced by another paradigm. Let us discover what is related to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Let us discover the Ukrainian, Polish parts of our history. And when I heard the young people celebrating the Litvaks in Lithuania, Litvak painters, when Lithuanians started celebrating Czesław Miłosz in literature, or for instance, Chaim Soutine in painting, I understood that this is quite important even within the wider context. Why am I saying this? Because, ladies and gentlemen, what happened to Central Europe, meaning the Grand Duchy of Lithuania plus the Polish Kingdom, the Rzeczpospolita, was an early, if you will, an early anticipation of the same European Union. Just compare the highly centralized monarchy like Spain or France to the Rzeczpospolita, and you will have roughly the European Union vis-a-vis homogenized empires. So these early anticipations of this sort of social and political order is the best antidote against our self-contempt. And I believe that the idea that Paul Celan could be as Ukrainian and as Romanian as he was Austrian as a poet, the idea that Chaim Soutine is as Lithuanian and as Belarusian as he was French, and as a friend of Amadeo Modigliani, that's the best case scenario for Western Europe as well. They could assume that the problem lies in Ubu in Ubu the King, meaning that painful and difficult memory and identity politics of Central Europe, which is, somehow disappointing. But we could say many things about naivete and moral provincialism of the West when it comes to the history of Central and Eastern Europe. So that's why the application of this pattern, when you regard a Lithuanian Jewish or Lithuanian Polish as inescapable part of your culture, could be absolutely vital for the EU if it wishes to become a fact of the 22nd century. If we are unable to celebrate an Italian, a Spanish, or French painter or writer or a Polish architect as something on our own, then vote to the European project. But that was part of our history. So that's why somehow it's quite, I think, wise to rediscover what has been successfully forgotten or marginalized by the prevailing pattern of history. So with this, I would remain quite optimistic. I would say that it's very important just to follow the path of Czesław Miłosz, or if you will, a Polish writer and cultural personality, Krzysztof Czyżewski, in saying they discover province. They transcend this sort of paradigm of center vis-a-vis the periphery. What is the real problem of the West is this dilemma, not to say the Manichaean divide between the center and periphery. It was the issue with older politics, but look at Great Britain after the Brexit. What happened was that they started mixing it up. The center moving to Brussels and periphery left for the UK itself. The periphery suffering from all-powerful Brussels. If we want to make things easier, we have to transcend this narrative and paradigm of the center versus periphery. And we have Miłosz, who was absolutely European, stunningly European in Switzerland, where the native realm, Radzenia Europa, was written. He started thinking about the book in Switzerland, in a small village, but he was as European in Paris, Berkeley, Warsaw, or Vilnius as he was in his Szateni, a small Lithuanian village. And the same applies to Czyżewski, who is trying to be a borderland person. He was trying to be just a European in Krasnogruda and Seini. That's the pattern for Europe. If we still think in terms of center and periphery, there will be thousands of reasons to envy London or Paris or Madrid, and there will be 1,000 of reasons to hate or despise the periphery of Europe. If we can discover the province as a sort of, as a sort of idea for self-definition for Europe at large, I would believe that that would be the idea which we can export. This is very much of a Polish idea. And Lithuanian at the same time.
Dziękuję bardzo. To w takim razie celowo Katarzynę Uczkiewicz zostawiłem.
Thank you very much. Well, I left Katarzyna Uczkiewicz on purpose for the very end. I wanted to add a question, expecting an answer similar to that uttered by Leonidas. That is, that something positive can indeed be uttered. We do have the European Capital of Culture, which is an attempt to communicate something within ourselves and to the external world. After nearly 1 year of the project, how do you value the communication? To what extent do you see any interest in what we have to say here? I am very happy to have heard Krzysztof Czyżewski mentioned and his idea, his concept of adding value to the peripheral. I do believe that this is one of the most valuable parts of the system. This is possibly something that we should teach Europe. Taking a global look at Europe, Europeans do not really wish to admit that they themselves may well become peripherals. And I do believe that this is something that deeply relates to the last question that we have heard. I don't think that it really matters, or I don't think that the externality of Wrocław matters. I believe that it did a lot for Wrocław and the residents of Wrocław to stop identifying themselves in comparison and reference to others. I believe they have begun to identify themselves internally. And I do believe that this is how we move away from Ubu le Roi. We are actually beginning to self-define, and we are no longer nowhere, I believe, once we are in Central Europe. But in order to export anything, you need the receiving party. You need demand. Whereas in the general discourse we find that so-called older Europe does not really is not really interested in listening to that. But I do see that I have heard a very interesting topic here, that is human rights. Well, definitely, the approach, the pre-1980 approach to human rights had been quite naive. Human rights were perceived as an area of values rather than the area for political discourse. Nonetheless, it allowed for a certain discourse among seeming adversaries. Let us mention the Polish-Czech dialogue here. And this dialogue actually took on certain political strength which could be translated into action, regardless of the changes brought about by 1989. Obviously, that was a huge surprise to what Central Europeans heard, that Western Europe believes that the human rights discourse has that Western Europe has a totally different take on human rights. For example, Andras Breivik is requesting new computer games, otherwise his human rights are going to be violated. Actually, such are values that are not necessarily expected from the viewpoint of Poland and Wrocław, a city of the displaced. You have to remember and understand that the Wrocław population was 100% changed after World War II. Well, I believe that it is quite typical for Wrocław that we operate within unfinished structures, within incomplete procedures, within a deep chaos, and this is why we had to work our own procedures out through and over decades and centuries of dependence and of the lack of our own state. I do believe there are certain ideas that blend us together, that make us one in Central Europe, while on the other hand make us different from all others. We do have certain values that we can follow in our own structures. This is also how 19th century rebel movements were born in Europe, but also in Poland. This is how we operated without specific structures, and we were quite successful at that. And I do believe, or I suppose, that such a talent for seeking and finding our identity without any borders is definitely a distinguishing factor for us. But is it a value? That question ought to be answered by anyone who will recognize that need as his or her own. I would like to now ask our audience to join us for a Q&A session. I will ask our guests to summarize at the end. Thank you very much. My name is Leszek Malinowski. I would like to address our Ukrainian guests and I would like you to convey our best wishes to our Ukrainian friends. You have proven to us that you could definitely go through an industrial revolution. You have also proven that the Russian bear has no longer any sharp teeth. I believe that he is losing his fur. Well, we have exported Professor Balcerowicz to you guys. He actually self-exported himself. Do you think that the Polish plague, quote unquote, can prove successful in your country as it has been as ours? Do you think that this is something that we could export to the Ukraine? Now to our other guest. I would like to polemize with what you said with regard to what you said about China. I would like to well, I do believe that they were they focused on what was feudal, I believe. I don't think that they took what was, they took the worst of both worlds with them. But I believe that in the future, feudalism is something that might affect us all. Let us take a look at multinationals, at corporations, for example. We are going to, well, collect a couple of questions and then hand over to our guests, please. I have the following commentary. I'm very happy that Mr. Riabchuk mentioned Wallenstein. I believe that this is a person that we tend to disremember in Poland. I believe that Wallenstein would be excellent in terms of how we perceive ourselves. He refers to Europe as a semi-peripheral, or semi-periphery. This leads to a certain paranoia, and it can be perceived both as an advantage and disadvantage. Well, we do know that Wallenstein has not been translated into Polish yet. On the other hand, we are quite self-critical, and we do have a tendency of trying to close the gap. We do have a certain, we follow a certain myth that we have to make up, we have to chase people. Whereas with regard to the peripheral versus the center, well, in in Warsaw, in Wrocław, Warsaw is associated with the fact that Wrocław bricks were taken to Warsaw, and also with the fact that Warsaw tends to be a place of birth for not necessarily very good political ideas, which are then grafted onto other soil. And I must say that when I travel to Warsaw, I have a sense of being in another country. And I find that it's quite interesting that people from such weeklies as Do Rzeczy or Polityka believe that you have to be there in this very center of things, and this is where you have to have your offices, and I believe that is quite absurd. We have many Polish cities. I have another question. I would like to define the utopia that we are talking about. Well, I believe that utopia is something that is an ecosystem, follows Frédéric Laloux, and also follows certain corporate concepts, and yet it no longer follows the cascade level, but it also affects the individual, and it touches upon ideas of the cohabitation. So it is actually a democratic utopia, or are we talking, or should we rather be talking about a sociocratic utopia? This is something that we are going to be talking about tomorrow and the day after. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Jeśli nie ma, to w takim razie wrócimy do ostatniej rundy. Może najpierw odpowiedzmy na konkretne
Let us begin with responding to specific questions. With regard to China, Radka, will you try?
Samozřejmě, já jsem to zjednodušila, je to jenom otázka toho, když jsem tam teď několik let pobývala, tak to pro mě byl šok, ale spíš šok, že jsem přemýšlela o Evropě.
Obviously, I had been oversimplifying my comment with regard to the shock of China and Europe.
Co se děje tam, co se děje u nás, ale i o tom, to, co já jsem považovala za, nebo považuji za důležité, a když to zjednoduším, protože to si když tak můžeme potom říci u vína, protože to je na dlouhé povídání, když to zjednoduším, pro mě byl ten šok, že skutečně je to tak, že zjednodušuji to, že ta společnost neví, nejenže neví, co jsou to ta lidská práva z našeho pohledu, nebo solidarita, nebo charita, ale vlastně v tomto bodě té společnosti, která funguje ten ekonomický pragmatismus propojený s celou tou podivuhodnou historií samozřejmě toho prostoru, tak ani neví, k čemu je to dobré. A to si myslím, že si můžu propátrat přes prostor románu a přes prostor jiného nového jazyka, protože my se... Pardon.
Obviously, what I am saying is definitely an oversimplification. This is something that I keep emphasizing. I would need much more time to be able to expand on the topic. Nevertheless, when in China, I was sufficiently shocked to then try and develop the topic. I do have the impression, I'm under the impression that this community, that the society, which really functions well in terms of economy, has absolutely no idea about the meaning of human rights or values or charity work. They don't understand, they have no idea of such concepts mentally as an abstract or a construct. This is something I see totally, I see as a distinguishing factor, and this is something that I can discuss in the language of novels. Please repeat your question. Well, I do have the definition of feudalism. Yes, these people live at a very low mental level. They want to survive and prosper and replace the bicycle with a car. But such are the Chinese, regardless of any revolutions. Even the first secretary of China, in a simile to those who came before him, are anonymous. It is actually an anti-utopia, an anti-fable. I don't know how many first secretaries they have or had, but they pauperized the Chinese community. They allowed capitalism. Nonetheless, they actually led them to a zilch mentality. So it is mental feudalism, if you will.
Já jsem se spíš přes tu Čínu právě vrátila k nám k Evropě, to znamená v Číně, jestliže jsou třeba zakázané knihy Václava Havla a u nás se mu vysmíváme v této chvíli, protože u nás existuje to slovo pravdoláskař, čili existuje země, kde za to slovo jsou lidé zatýkáni nebo se je tak jako pomučí, ale vlastně u nás žijeme v bušině slov, kde nikdo za ta slova neodpovídá, nic to neznamená, takže je to i návrat, že to slovo a myšlenka má nějakou váhu, co se to děje. A my jsme prostě součástí toho celého světa, my zapomínáme na tu politiku lidství, my sice nezapomínáme na globální biznis, ale to jsou důležité věci, i to slovo humanismus omít a vrátit. Takže to neznamená, že já tam něco, je to spíš jako rozloupnutí, nebo já když něčemu nerozumím, tak se potřebuju prosvětlit a ten román nedám přes prostor románu, takže když jsem si léta prosvětlovala romány, mentalitu prostoru, kde jsem se narodila, kde pravděpodobně teda i zemřu, tak teď samozřejmě ten svět je pro mě širší a to téma tam se mě i jako nacházejí, to není tak, že takže je to otázka, a není to, jestli je něco lepší, horší, spíš si prosvětlit tu dobu, ve které já jsem se ocitla.
With regard to China, it was a certain counterpoint. I want to go back or to come back to Europe in terms of the topic itself. For example, in China it is forbidden to celebrate the day of Václav Havel, whereas in the Czech Republic currently Václav Havel is a
figure that is often not scoffed at. Whereas, and I do find that it is quite sad that people can actually be punished for quoting Václav Havel several thousand kilometers away, whereas here he is being scoffed, he is being mocked. So I do believe that certain values can only be truly understood from the other side. It is not about a comparison. Mykola, Riabchuk, any comments on what has been said?
I can't really tell you much about Balcerowicz because there is very little information what he actually does. The government is, or the Ukrainian government is doing better. I don't know whether it's thanks to Balcerowicz, but I think Balcerowicz is like this really secret weapon that we don't know what it does, but everybody's scared of it. I don't want to say anything about Russia. Nothing, simply. Because, well, everybody knows. About solidarity, I do have one comment. Polish solidarity is very important for us. It's very highly valued. For 2 years, Poland is one of the countries which are most respected by Ukrainians. It's number one, actually. The Polish position in these ranking lists have always been quite good, but for the past 2 years running, it's been number one, despite all the different historical disputes, whatnot. So this is indeed an incredible change. Unfortunately, this is not anything that we see with respect to other Central European countries. It was a bit of a surprise to me when, for example, there was the situation in Georgia and there were no protests by other countries such as the Czechs or the Slovaks. And I think that it shows you the limitations of Kundera's concept. It used to be, I think, an exclusive concept. This whole concept was like an appeal to the West that here we are, we belong to Europe, and it promoted the inclusion of Central Europe to the West, but it did exclude everything else, everything that was beyond Central Europe. And it does remain insignificant to, for example, the political classes, be it in Czech Republic or other countries, and this is a huge disappointment. And I think that's all that I could respond to, really. Yes, well, this more general question I will leave for later. And would anybody else like to ask a question from the floor? Any bidders from the floor? Because I'm going to be closing this round soon, so last chance. I have the following question. Are utopias not more real, and taking into consideration, for example, education, in which the traditional system is completely outdated, and all these alternative educational systems, they do seem very utopian, but at the same time they teach skills that will be needed in 5 years' time, or already needed, where emotional intelligence is number 5, creativity number 3, teamwork, negotiations, these are all very highly valued skills. And these schools are very few in number, but these are the schools that actually are the actual sort of teaching institutions, not utopian at all. Yes, I see that you're trying to lead us off these tracks, or you're trying to steer us onto more universal thinking, what is this universal vector, what is this universal locomotive, because maybe we are not looking where we should be looking. Maybe we should be looking more into organization, education, when we search for utopias. So let us grapple with this question, and that will lead us to a discussion we'll open tomorrow morning. So Leonidas, perhaps we could begin with you. And there's also an opportunity for you to perhaps refer to or respond to the previous questions.
Yeah, thank you. I will be more specific on this tomorrow morning because I will be trying to elaborate more on utopia and utopianism nowadays. But by and large, I could tell you that it's very important to define utopia. Much depends on how we define utopia. Because on the one side, utopia could be a dream about just society, the way it was from St. Thomas More or Sir Thomas More. So then another story is utopia as social satire or social critique. So then utopia could be perceived as a blueprint for social and moral order or blueprint for social and political order. And I think that at this point, the greatest disappointment, the greatest disenchantment with utopias in Eastern and Central Europe, of course, was related to utopianism as a blueprint for universal social and moral order. And if we remember the way Karl Popper described it, it was about global utopia, not small scale, but global utopia as global social engineering. Well, I can understand this very, very easily because Eastern and Central Europe became playground for utopian ideas. That was the place when they were tested. So if someone tried to put them into life, that was here in Central and Eastern Europe. So that's why let me remind you that there was nothing Eastern or Central European about the idea of socialism, which was very much of a German and French idea. So, but the point is that, and not only Marxism, I'm not talking about Marxism exclusively. Just look at Russia. I'm just touching upon the aspect of its philosophical clashes in the 19th century. The paradox of Russian history was that Slavophiles, who were, in a way, calling for retrospective utopia, trying to get back to the golden age of Russian symphonic unity and spirituality, in a way, were people who were defending German ideas of Schelling and Herder, whereas Zapadniki, or Westerners, were Hegelians in most cases. This is how, in Russia, German ideas competed and clashed. So there were many paradoxes on our soil, and that's why we can understand the disenchantment. But it doesn't absolve us from a very important question, and at this point, I take it very seriously. Is it possible to get rid of utopia as a kind of warm phenomenon in Ernst Bloch's description? What happens to social theory if we abandon utopia? What happens to the soul of social dream, social and political dream? Let me tell you that it's a very serious question because I think that without the elements of utopia, the principle of alternative can be put into question. And this is very serious because humanity cannot live without alternatives. This is for sure. Everything in this world has its hidden alternative. So that's why it could be quite naive to dismiss or write off utopia. But I believe that what happened to utopianism was that once it was, in a way, abandoned or thrown out through the window, it may come back through the door, so to say, or the other way around. Meaning that utopianism is alive and well in many cases. Even the belief in the free market economy, in a way, it's utopian. What happened to Eastern Europe was we had the Marxian dogma. It had to be replaced with something because people didn't believe in Marxism anymore. So we had neoliberal dogma, which came as a replacement in some cases. I know people who spent a good part of their lives as Komsomol or Communist Party functionaries or apparatchiks. Nowadays, they are enthusiastically, even with religious fervor, defending the free market economy. So meaning that utopianism is impossible to get rid of. You can throw it through the door, it may come back through the window. But curiously enough, I believe that classical utopianism, in a way, was a form of determinism with a belief in progress, evolution. What happened to the ideas of progress, evolution, was that they were replaced by another thing, which I will discuss tomorrow morning, namely by Tina. There is no alternative. How can you live with utopias if you deny alternatives? If there is no alternative, you have determinism. So the irony is that once having been deterministic itself, utopianism is becoming an antidote against determinism nowadays, which happens to educational utopias, piecemeal, I would say small-scale utopianism, local utopian experiments. And I think that what was very important to do was to rehabilitate utopianism as social criticism, as a social satire. Because if we deny utopianism, the question arises as what is to be done with laughter, with humor? What is to be done with the huge tradition of humor and laughter in European literature? It's very easy to abandon utopia, but it's very difficult to abandon laughter, critique, whether it be Rabelais or whether it could be Gombrowicz.
Dziękuję. Mykola, czy jeszcze coś
Thank you very much, Nicola. Would you like to add anything? No, I agree.
Bardzo proszę, Katarzyna.
I agree. I have nothing to add. Katarzyna? Perhaps there's only one addition that I would like to make, because you've pretty much drawn us down to this basic term or notion, forgetting that Utopia, after all, was an island. And indeed, we think about utopia in geopolitical terms, more in the context of Huxley or anti-utopianism, knowing that a utopia realized leads to some kind of a totalitarianism. And perhaps, indeed, what you've indicated, namely a privatization of utopia, going back to private utopias, is maybe a sign of the times of a sort, that indeed today we are building ever new islands, our own islands of utopia. And sometimes I think that it is linked to the fact that this last beautiful utopia is this neoliberal utopia that we're constantly discussing in the context of Central Eastern Europe, and the utopia of Fukuyama, that perhaps has not tested well, or it has come to an exhaustion, that there's nothing to say. Yeah, but it's the same utopia. Yes, that absolutely, it's the same utopia. And your private utopias that you're talking about, be it local utopias or connected with the specific communities, are possible simply because of the fact that that utopia came to a realization. Thank God, not entirely, because it would again transform itself into a totalitarianism, something that we know about as realists. Thank you very much, Radka. This is your last chance to perhaps add to something that's been missing or refer to the four speakers.
Mně se líbí jedna věc, že sice tady o tom mluvíme a nakonec se pak ukazuje, že nejdůležitější je to, co hraje roli v životě každého člověka, jak se popasuje s tím, co před něj ten život postaví, a mnohdy nad vším my si můžeme všechny prognózy zmizí, nebo to, co očekáváme, nebo můžeme dělat politické rozbory, a občas se také stane to, že to překvapení pozitivní přijde ze strany, kde to nečekáme, že ta iracionalita lidského života nad vším zvítězí. A co se týká třeba politiky, tak já mám utopii.
Tak dobře, tak to, co mi se nejbardziej podoba.
What I like the most is that here we are sitting and discussing, philosophizing or carrying out these geopolitical discussions about utopia, but at the end of the day, everything pretty much boils down to the individual, how a specific person, being, deals with the specific challenges, tasks, or one's life. And in this discussion here, it is very visible that at the end of the day, we're going back to this individual perspective. In terms of geopolitics,
Jsem ráda třeba, že to byla také veliká utopie, třeba Havlova charta 77, a já se neumím představit, že by nevznikla tehdy a neexistovala, že by bylo obrovské vákuum, si myslím, v našem prostoru. A v politice by se mi líbilo, protože se ukazuje, že před rokem 89 jsme měli teda vládu jedné strany, teď máme vládu několika, 2, 3 stran, a samozřejmě to také svádí k zneužití té moci, kdy by šlo vymyslet, že by skutečně se do té politiky dostali jedinci, kteří by nepotřebovali podporu stranickou a celou tu mašinérii a celou ten loajální přístup. Tak to ještě nemám promyšlené, ale to je utopie, která třeba je to.
Natomiast warto pamiętać, że na przykład
we should remember that Charter 77, the biggest Czech opposition organization, was a sort of a utopia that actually was realized to an effect. And speaking from the vantage point of today, it would be difficult to imagine what would have happened if it wasn't for Charter 77. And whilst before we had the authority of a single party. Today we have the authority or 2 or 3 parties in power, but the situation hasn't really changed much because everything is still based on the principles of loyalty and hierarchy, only that it's not a single party but 3 parties. And how it's all going to develop, well, that I still need to think about. Well, thank you very much. I will not sum up everything that's been said. This is only the opening of the conference. I'm happy that I had not actually agreed it with the panelists, but they have very intuitively been able to lead us on to different issues that will be discussed over the next 2 days in terms of also local utopias that are out there somewhere far away from the center, that at the same time at one or another point go back to the global circuit, and that interpreters or translators are needed for that. Obviously, Pope Francis is a person like that who simply introduces the Latin American, almost metaphysics, into the global circuit. So the flow and exchange of ideas has begun between the center and the peripheries, or at least they have become more lively. This is something that we will be speaking about at greater length tomorrow. Leonidas has already mentioned that tomorrow we'll be talking about how utopias, this categories of thinking, will have evolved, and we'll have later on other speakers follow that, and then we'll be talking about how the world is to be saved by technological progress. We'll be talking about post-capitalism and the world of women and radical feminism, and then at the end of the conference we'll go back to the starting point, namely we'll try to again grapple with in a more Polish manner, if you will, to what extent solidarity, as described in the West as the biggest social innovation of the second half of the 20th century, and its program or its platform, it wasn't a capitalist platform, to what extent this platform or this program could be used in the times of capitalism. We'll have Jadwiga Stanisław as the introductory lecturer, and we'll see what comes out of all this.